Take some new solder. How's it going, everyone? Greg here with RC Driver, and this is our Get Into RC video series. Yep, I'm back with episode number 19, and this time I'm going to talk to you about the basics of soldering. I know you guys have been waiting for another Get Into RC video series. Sorry for the wait, but this one should be pretty cool for those of you who have been interested in learning how to solder your own stuff. And since we did all about wires and all about connectors in the last episode that I did, this is a pretty good follow-up. So I've gathered up everything I think I need to talk to you guys about, and I'm just going to start going over some of the tools that you're going to need, talk about soldering irons a little bit, and I'm going to show you guys pretty much the basics of soldering, show you how to solder a couple of connectors, maybe some wires onto a motor, and give you guys a general feel of what you need to do and all the different steps so you get a perfect soldering job on your vehicle. All right, so let's start off on the tool side of the bench. And the first thing I do want to talk to you about is safety glasses. You are going to be working with hot metals here, so you want to wear some safety glasses. With that important message out of the way, now I can talk to you about some of the other tools you're going to need. Obviously, some of the things you're going to need are some wire cutters. When you're working on your RC machine, most likely you're going to have to cut the wire to length. And so what a lot of people use are just standard wire cutters you buy at the store. And these are pretty dirty, actually. But what these have are they have some cutters here, and you could go and cut the wire with that. And then these are the wire stripper parts, so you could strip off the insulation of the wire, and I'll show you that process in a little bit. One other thing I'll use in a pinch, I'll use a pair of side cutters, some decent side cutters, just to get a nice clean cut on the wire. So these are a must-have. And then as far as the insulation goes, if you use just the regular type of cutters to cut the wire itself, what I like to have on hand is a hobby knife, and this will help you strip off any insulation that you'll need, and I'll show you that process in a little bit. And then obviously we're going to get into the iron itself. Let me talk about a couple other things first. So one thing that might be great to have on hand is a pair of extra hands, basically. And this right here is a block made by STL Customs, and there are a number of these blocks, type of blocks out there. And what these do are they hold different connectors. So there's a bunch of holes in here. There's this clip on the front, and it holds Dean's connectors, or actually holds the little bars for Traxxas connectors. And what you do is you stick your connector in there, and basically it allows you to use one hand for the soldering iron, the other to maybe put solder in, or hold the wire to the connector. A device like this basically just helps you get the job done. Might be a good tool to have in your collection. And then we get into some of the soldering stuff itself. Obviously, shrink wrap, it's a must-have for pretty much every soldering job, or most soldering jobs that you're going to encounter. If you're putting, here, let me grab this speed controller over here. If you're soldering connectors on the wires, you want to protect any exposed metal of the connector just so you don't get any type of short. Yes, if these two connectors, or if some of these connectors touch each other while you're running, it could short out, blow out your electronics. So you want to have some shrink wrap on hand just to cover any exposed wires. And now I can start talking about, let me do solder. So this here is a Kester 44 rosin core solder. Over here I have some solder from Track Power. It's a rosin core silver solder. Do yourself a favor and get a good quality solder. Seek it out, whether it's from an RC company, most likely it's going to work for your application, or from an electronics company, a good electronics company like Kester. This is what I've been using for years, probably since I've started in the RC hobby. Really good solder, but the rosin core, it really helps get that nice clean solder finish, and you don't need extra flux to solder your connectors. That's really for other applications, really not necessary here. As long as you're using a good rosin core solder, everything will work out just fine. So definitely get a good solder. Don't go to the local big box store and get some thick solder that they have here for general electric use. It's probably not going to work well, and you'll get really frustrated. It's just not what we use here in the RC market. So this right here is a basic 60 watt, 110 volt soldering iron. This one's from Track Power, and I think it costs like 16 bucks, and it's like another $6 for the stand. But this is a very basic setup here, and it'll get the job done for those of you who are soldering occasionally. Something you'll want to look for is an iron that has a good heat range to it. That you don't want something for crafting or hobby type use where you're like burning wood or something like that. You want something with more of a heat to it. And then check out the tip as well. You're going to want a decent sized tip. And with this track power iron, it's a tip that can work on a number of different wires and connectors and something like that. But if you have a very fine pinpoint used for very small wires or soldering circuits, probably not going to work well for general RCU. So find something with a little bit more of a blunt tip to it, and that should get the job done. Make sure it's got a sponge on here. I'm going to talk about having a sponge. Very important to getting a good solder joint, and a lot of people forget about that. Oh, missed the heat gun over here. So the heat gun is for the shrink wrap that I talked to you about. It's just a nice, easy way to get a good, clean shrink on that shrink wrap. You could also use the side of your iron here. Basically, run the iron around the outside of the shrink wrap, and the heat will help shrink it. I've seen some people use like cigarette lighters to shrink wrap. That'll work in a pinch, but what I don't like about that, sometimes it kind of leaves like a little burn mark to it. So kind of pass on the cigarette lighter unless it's absolutely necessary. And then you've got your high-end soldering iron. So this here is a digital track power soldering station. This is a pretty cool unit to have if you think you're going to do a lot of soldering, whether it's on your big connectors, small connectors, or even fine type soldering where you're maybe soldering servo wires into your servo. I know a lot of people shorten their servo wires or ESC wires. So this particular model here, it allows you to adjust the temperature. So when you are working on smaller soldering projects, you could turn the temperature down a little bit, or you could crank it back up if you have a heavier gauge wire. It comes with the base, comes with the sponge. Actually, this one comes with an additional tip as well, a little chisel tip, and that'll really just cover all the bases for your hobby needs. So definitely, if you're gonna be in the hobby for a while, might want to grab yourself a good soldering iron. And then this is something else I got from Track Power. It's another way to clean the tip out. It's got more of an abrasive type material in this little compartment here. Allows you to clean the tip off very well. It's a very important part of the process, and I'm going to show you that in a little bit. Actually, I'm going to show you that right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of these connectors that I have here. I've got a Dean's connector, I've got an XT connector, I've got some bullet connectors. Actually, got a speed controller here that I need to wire up, so I'm going to show you how to do it on that. And I'm just going to show you a couple of different examples of soldering and all the different steps you should do, from when you pick up the iron in your hand to tinning the wires, and then how long you should hold the wire and soldering iron into place. So there are a number of different steps to soldering, so why don't we go over to the workbench and I'll show you how it's done. All right, so before we start soldering, I just want to talk to you guys quickly about the wire. As you can see here, I've got a 12 gauge wire and a 14 gauge wire. The 14 gauge wire is obviously smaller. The higher the number of the gauge, the smaller the wire is going to be. The 12 gauge wire here, this will carry a higher current basically. So if you have a car that has like 4S power, 6S power, you're going to want to go with a heavier gauge wire rather than a smaller gauge wire. The other thing I kind of want to point out is, go grab your wire from a hobby store. They typically carry wires that are good for hobby use. The wire inside basically has a lot more strands to it, making it a lot more flexible. So it's not like the junky wire that you go buy at a big box store that has really thick strands and is not flexible. Just flexible wires make it a lot easier to route in RC cars. Okay, so now the next thing is to strip the insulation. The outside sheathing here is called the insulation, and basically you're going to need to strip it off so you expose the wires. So you could either take your wire strippers here and find the proper gauge. It's usually listed here what gauge it is, and then go and strip a piece of wire off. You don't need to strip a lot off, just basically you need to strip off the amount that's going to go onto the connector. So you take a quick look at that, then you go and you strip your wire down. And the method I like to use is actually with the X-Acto knife. So I like to come in here and just take the X-Acto knife and roll the wire underneath it, and that gives me my cut, and then I could just come back, peel off the wire nice and neat. Now if you do need to cut the wire, make sure you use a good pair of cutting pliers. This is a mini side cutter that I've kind of retired from cutting plastics, and it's what I use to cut wire now. You cut the wire here on the pliers. That's what the lower portion's for. Basically, when you do cut the wire, just make sure you give yourself a little extra slack just in case something happens and you need to make an adjustment later on. And now for the next step, pretty important step for getting a nice clean soldering job is to actually go back and twist the strands of the wire. This tightens up the strands, and it's less likely to spread out as you push down on the soldering iron to make that solder joint. So once the strands are tight, Now you could go and tin the wires. Now tinning the wires is basically adding solder to the wires. I'll just stick this in the little holder here, and now that'll give me free hands to go and solder. Now, don't just go running out and trying to blob some solder on here. What you're always going to want to do, and this is a good tip, is every time you pull your soldering iron out of the soldering holder, always wipe the tip off. Having a clean solder tip is key to getting a good solder joint. Now that it's clean, you could go and apply fresh solder to the tip, and now you could start soldering. And just hold the tip gently against the side of the wire and let the solder do the work. And you don't want to have big globs of solder on there, so you come back. And there you have it. This is a pretty good example of a well-tinned wire. And once I've done my soldering, what I then do is I, again, go back, wipe the soldering tip off just to make sure it's clean before putting it back. All right, now that this is tinned, I could go and tin my connectors. So I have a Dean's connector here. I've actually went and tinned it before, but I'll show it to you again. It's basically the same process we just used on the wire itself, but just really quickly wipe your tip off. Always do that first. Come apply some solder on the soldering iron, and then go and add a little bit more. As you can see right there, we have a nice bubble of solder on that tab. It was really quick. You don't want to hold your soldering iron there too long, because what can happen is it could heat up that bar inside the connector, melt the plastic, and it won't allow you to insert your battery plug later. So that could be a big problem. But really quick, and make sure it's shiny. That's another important part of soldering. Always make sure your solder is shiny. If it's a very dull look, that's called a cold solder joint. And cold solder joints don't transfer current efficiently, and they also chance breaking off whatever you've soldered. So make sure it's shiny. If it's shiny, you're good to go. Now that we have the wires tinned and our plugs tinned, we could go and actually solder the wire to the connector now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take a piece of shrink wrap. This is a pretty important step too. Always use shrink wrap to cover any bare wires on your solder joints. It just prevents an accident from happening later on. So you take a piece of shrink wrap. I like to cut it a bit longer than the solder area, just to make sure that the area is covered and the shrink wrap is secured in place. Kind of grabs onto the insulation here. So what I'm going to do is slide that on and slide it all the way down as far away from the solder joint as possible. Basically because the heat could start to shrink it while you're soldering. So I like to slide it all the way to the end there. And now I'm going to solder the positive wire on. Just make sure you know where you're positive. Positive is always plus, obviously, your red wire. So just double check that before you start soldering everything. Once you've got that all figured out, now you come back, grab your soldering iron, make sure you clean that tip. Always clean the tip. Add a little bit of solder to the soldering iron tip. Now you have some fresh solder on there, and just come in and allow the heat of the iron and solder to do the work. Just like that, got a pretty nice solder joint there, nice and shiny. I could have centered it a little bit better, but you get the idea. That was really quick. I didn't hold it there for long. I didn't melt the connector, and this joint is good to go. Now, if you got a big blob of solder on there, probably not a good idea. You probably want to go and take your iron, knock that solder off, and resolder your joint later. Big globs are just usually a sign of a solder joint that isn't very good. So make sure it looks very similar to this, and you should be good to go. Now once you have your solder joint to the way you like it, simply just slide up the heat shrink, and then you can go back, like I said earlier, use the side of the iron to heat up the shrink wrap, or what I'm going to do is use a heat gun to shrink the shrink wrap. There you have it. That solder joint is ready to go. Now I can move on to the negative. So as you saw before, I just used my fingers to hold the wire. I've been soldering for a long time, so the heat doesn't bother me. What you could also use are a pair of pliers to hold the wire. So that's what I'm going to do for the negative here. I'm going to take my soldering iron, just wipe off the tip, and then I'll add some fresh solder to it. And now I could take that wire with the pliers and just solder it. And there you have it, a nice smooth solder joint there, pretty shiny. It's ready for me to just slide on the shrink wrap and finish up the job. And there you have it, nice factory look there on the wires. Okay, so here I have an XT60 plug. I actually need to make an adapter for my charger. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead. I'm going to pre-tin the metal connectors here. Just add a little bit of solder. Do it to both sides. It's tinned. I've actually already pre-tinned my wires over here. Slide on my shrink wrap. Now I can take my iron, wipe off the tip, add some fresh solder, and then allow the iron and solder just to do the work. No extra pressure. Just let it just drop in there. Wipe off that tip again. And check that out. That's the perfect solder joint right there. Really nice and shiny. It's got a good adhesion to it. Now I'll just slide the shrink wrap on. And of course, heat it up. Perfect. Now bullet connectors, pretty much the same process here. I like to stick it in my little holder. And then a lot of bullet connectors, they have this little channel here. And that's typically where the wire comes out on the side here. There are going to be some instances where you need to position the wire straight up and down, but typically the wire just sits in this little channel here. So start again by wiping off the tip of your iron. Take some new solder. Just add it to the bullet plug here. Make sure it's nice and tinned. I've already tinned the wire here. Now I can come back in, add some fresh solder to the iron, and then just let the solder and the iron do the work. Just let it fall on its own weight basically. And just that quickly, it's all set to go. Check it out, another perfect soldering job. And of course, it takes a little bit of practice to do it, but you should be able to get it done. Now, depending on the iron you have, if you have an adjustable iron, you may need to play with the heat in order to get the type of result you're looking for. But with a standard kind of low-cost iron like I showed you earlier, doing 14 gauge and smaller wire shouldn't be a problem. It's just when you get to that larger gauge wire, you might need a better iron with a higher heat range in order to solder. Okay, so for the final demo, I'm just going to show you really quickly how to solder a wire onto a tab of a motor. Pretty much the same thing you've seen before. So I've already gone ahead, I've pre-tinned everything here. I've already pre-tinned my wire. So basically, again, clean off your soldering tip, add some fresh solder, and allow the iron and solder just to do all the work for you. See, nice and quick. I have a pretty good bulb of solder on there, maybe a little too much solder, but it's not touching the other tabs. You want to make sure it doesn't touch your other tabs. But that solder joint there looks pretty good, got a nice shine to it. Now I could go ahead and solder the rest of my wires. So soldering really isn't a scary task. It's something that anybody could do with just a little bit of practice. What I suggest doing is find some extra wire that's hanging around. Maybe grab some extra wire when you're at the hobby store and just practice on that. Before you start practicing on your connectors or your motor or anything like that, practice on the wire first. And once you get the hang of it, then move over and do your actual soldering job. But nothing to be scared about. Just take the time to do all the steps properly, just like I just showed you, and you should do just fine. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. We've got more Get Into RC videos coming up pretty soon, so make sure you subscribe, hit the notifications button, give this video a like, and when you have some more time, head over to rcdriver.com.